As you guys know, Darrell Issa was originally going to join us here, but he is occupied in Washington.
I have my red sweater on, though.
So. Yeah, I'm wearing blue.
See the bullets, yeah. So Seamus has worked with Darrell for a long time and is now the executive director of the Open Gov Foundation, which Darrell set up to pursue his ideas about government data and transparency. So he can stand in for Darrell in getting across a key message that we really believe very deeply at Code for America, which is that better government can and should be a transpartisan issue. Those of us who care about this country should and must put politics aside and start saying, how do we actually make the machinery of government work better? How do we design a system for the 21st century that actually brings to life our ideals as a country of government, by, for, and of the people? This is an amazing, amazing foundational document that we have. There's a lot of disagreement sometimes about what the founders meant, but I think it is the challenge of all of us in this democracy and in other democracies around the world to actually bring to life those ideals and to use the tools that we have today in a country that has orders of magnitude more people than when the founders wrote that document, to bring it to life through new mechanisms and new tools. And both of these guys have been working in their own way on that issue of how we bring this vision of democracy into the 21st century. So I want to start out by asking each of you, how would you define open government? What does it mean to you? What's important?
Well, let me just pick up on your point. It's interesting. I spent about a year and a half looking at best practices as it relates to open government and looking at different platforms of engagement and trying to move past a mindset that's difficult as an elected official of looking at technology exclusively as a way of getting elected, as a way of amplifying your voice to get you to turn out to vote on Election Day or write a check or volunteer for me. And then I turn those voices off right after Election Day to start to process, as Tim was saying, a different governance model. What I found fascinating and somewhat alarming from the perspective as a member of the Democratic Party was the effectiveness to which I saw that engagement on the Republican side of the aisle. We tend to connote some connection because of Obama's success as it relates to his campaigns, that we are so far ahead technologically in terms of our democratic prowess. But in fact, it's folks like Darrell Issa, folks like Eric Cantor, that have been doing some really interesting and fascinating thing on the open government side with Madison and UCUT, Citizen Co-Sponsor, all of these remarkable initiatives that go to answering your question, Tim, about what open government can mean in a post-partisan way, where we're not focusing on who's to blame, but what to do. We're not quarreling, we're actually leading, but we're leading together as co-producers. We're not doing things to citizens, but doing things with citizens. And you have been on the vanguard of that in terms of creating these new platforms, and you've dove deeply into this, and perhaps you're better situated to answer Tim's question because you're answering it very substantively.
Well, thank you, Gavin. It comes down to shared work, in our opinion. The electoral process that we get so caught up in with partisanship is really one day a year. And all that money that goes into campaigns and technology is focused on driving a lever-pulling operation that maybe happens, twice every 4 years, when all the important stuff happens the other 364 days a year. And that's the work of government. And right now, government isn't doing a whole lot of work on the federal level, but that's where our perspective and our definition of open government came from, is we have a job to do as legislators. It's to write legislation and pass bills. How do we share that work with people? We're not the smartest guys in the room, or gals. How do we open up and tap into the knowledge that exists outside of the great firewall that exists around Washington and make our jobs easier and more efficient? If we start there, that's our interest, or that was our interest with Madison.
So I have a question for you. Madison was used for the Data Act, which was, a technology-related bill that drew a lot of interest, from the internet community. And you did get citizen input into that bill, which was kind of remarkable. We always hear stories of lobbyists actually writing the language that appears in bills, but to actually have citizens write it, that was, something unheard of for the last couple of hundred years, I think. But Madison has not been used for other bills, at least as far as I know. And have you had trouble getting adoption of that by Darrell's colleagues in the House? And
Well, it scares the heck out of him, really.
are you still trying? Have you given up on that as an idea?
We have not given up. We wouldn't be here if we did. And actually, I think we're more inspired given all of the great work that we've been seeing going on here today and the speakers have been talking about. It scares the heck out of people, though, to see their legislation and their actual work up online for comment and feedback. Twitter and Facebook are great, but when you actually get down to the core of a congressperson's job, which is bills, and that's on the internet, that really sets some people off. And I really liked what David was saying as far as getting to the bottom of the stack. When you're looking at the federal government, that's the bottom of the stack. When you're looking at a state government, that's the bottom of the stack. The law and the legislation that's going on.
So I guess one of the key questions, given that this is a meeting of people who are predominantly focused on the city level, should we be trying to evangelize Madison to cities? It's kind of, Jen did a pivot as we started our work in Washington with the GovToO Summit. And then when she had the insight to go work with cities and start Code for America, it was that this was actually the level where a lot more happens, that it impacts the lives of citizens. And it's also a more tractable level. Should we be looking at the same thing here? Are there any sort of signs of Madison's uptake in local legislation?
That's what we tried to do. So then, thanks to a generous grant by the Knight Foundation, we were funded to take Madison from the federal government to a state and a local level. And like any developers, we had a tool that worked and walked into the situation and said, oh, we can just redeploy it and it's going to solve all the problems. We ran into the reality that there was no open data for Madison to run on. So we actually had to pivot to create that open data so that our cool tool and a lot of other cool tools could help on a state and local legislative level, and that's where we are today.
So Tim, just because having experience now, representing the world's 8th largest economy, close to a $2 trillion economy, so about as large as you get outside the federal government, and representing a city and a county, a smaller city and county, I can tell you the place to start, seems to me, and I'm not arguing against your model, but I'm arguing to answer Tim's question by inverting that pyramid and going local, is the local level, because the persuasion industry doesn't have as much influence at the local level. You can out-hustle the persuasion industry. And
just look at Spike.
What's that?
When you want to talk about hustle, just look at Spike.
Yeah, well, that's right. Look at Spike, absolutely. And the, dare I say it, quote me, I don't care, the IT cartel.
Yeah.
And at the state level, though, good luck. 2/3, 3/4, I don't know, maybe 90% of all these bills. I didn't know it. I thought I knew but I had no idea how much these guys have themselves wrapped around the entire legislative process at the state level. We don't write bills. It's a shock. Honestly, it would be a grand exception if 1 or 2 of the 3,000 bills that are introduced every single year were actually written by a human being that wasn't representative of a particular special interest group. So the power of what you're promoting is, from my perspective, profound. And unless we reconcile it, we're not going to reconcile this growing, and it's so self-evident now, but this growing discontent between those that watch what's happening from afar, even locally from afar, and feel totally disengaged and disempowered in terms of the life of their city, state, and nation.
Well, I'll tell you, I'd love to see Oakland adopt Madison. Libby, if you're in the audience still, maybe you could bring some legislation using it in Oakland. I'm sure that the Oakland Brigade would be happy to help.
Yeah.
This sort of notion of we already opened this idea of cities and metropolitan areas as the key locus. Less in the throes of the lobbyist cartel. Citizens, care. They sort of feel like they can affect local issues more. Are there other reasons we should be focusing on local?
Well, there's the old saw. It says states are laboratories of democracy. I think that's true. But cities are laboratories of innovation. There's more of an iterative spirit, cause and effect, good decisions, bad. And at the end of the day, back to your opening point, Tim, if I ever came out with a democratic plan to clean up graffiti, you guys would have laughed me out of town.
But you know,
But at the state level, it's the Democratic plan for jobs in the economy. Federal level, it's the Republican plan, Democrat. So at local level, it's a less ideological.
Although, you know, you can make a strong statement, as you did, for example, when you were mayor of San Francisco, with your position on gay marriage, where that had a pretty strong tipping point effect in the narrative, in the discussion of that as a national issue. So that's one of the things that I think I'm really interested in understanding, you know, if we can make change at the local level, you know, is that actually the most powerful way to make change at the state and national level as well?
Success leaves clues. You got to prove your point. You're dealing with so many people that are ideological. You need to give them evidence contrary to their predisposition. And so if you can start proving a point, all of a sudden then others can learn from those examples and begin to experiment on their own. So I think the answer is unequivocally, absolutely yes. You can't sell down visions anymore. It's all about bringing people together and collaboratively engaging folks outside in, not inside out. And that's the larger paradigm of this old industrial construct that's being completely reshaped as it relates to what brings us all together here as it relates to the network.
I have a question from Twitter. By the way, Lauren, can you include the Twitter handle of the person asking the question? It's nice to give them a shout out. So basically the question is, who is commenting on open legislation via Madison? Is it lay people, experts? Does it matter? And will it change?
I would say it doesn't matter.
Oh, that's from Kevin Curry.
Oh, Kevin
Okay.
Curry. Thanks, Kevin. There you are. Right on. It's domain experts. Every piece of legislation has a domain expert or has a group of them. And right now, the federal government's not doing much right now, but were it open, the federal government would be working on regulations, on legislation that affects something that every single person in this room knows something about and cares about. And the first bills we put up in Madison were tech-related. It was used initially to kill SOPA and to craft and crowdsource an alternative called the Open Act. And you can see all of that at keepthewebopen.com. So you can actually see who was commenting. They have names, they have times, it's accountable. So you had people in Silicon Valley who knew how the internet worked and who were shut out of the process, commenting on things that they knew and cared deeply about. Replicate that from agriculture bills to spending legislation to tax bills. I want the people who know the most about an issue sharing that expertise with their elected officials. Equally with normal citizens like you and me, and that's what Madison does.
Yeah, that's really interesting. By the way, obviously the message from this is more questions from Twitter if you have them. But you know, this notion of subject matter experts being deeply committed is obviously key to things like Wikipedia. It isn't sort of general people who write some of these very detailed articles, people who care passionately about that one issue. And I think one of the things that, you know, I've long observed about open source software is the modularity of software really matters, that somebody can write a small piece that works with other small pieces that other people are writing, as opposed to, you know, these, you know, traditional massive systems that are put together by thousands of people with centralized control. And doesn't that push us in the direction of saying that legislation also should be moving in the direction of small pieces rather than these massive 1,000-page omnibus bills that have so much sandwiched into them? Have you thought at all about, either of you, about that notion of how do we get smaller units of legislation so that people who care about them can find out about them?
What's been your experience in that?
Well, that was actually the end product of our Madison beta test. So we started it with SOPA in December 2011, and we ran it through January of this year. We started with long bills, and when people started interacting with it, marking it up, editing it, and suggesting changes, they were only focused on 2 or 3 real small operative paragraphs, the real heart of the issue. And as we moved forward, we tested, okay, can we collaborate on legislation? Can we collaborate on a statement of principles, so a shorter policy document? Wrapping the results of all that together, can we introduce a bill that's 1 page long that just attacks and solves one problem? And will people understand it? And the answer was yes.
Yeah.
So that was actually the end point, and it was natural because that's how technology works.
And at peril of getting myself more, I bet 50% of the people that introduce bills have never even read them, let alone gone through this process of even understanding them. So some of the authors of the bills would do very well by participating in the back end of marking up their own work.
Yeah,
it fixes stupid. I mean, frankly, we put bills up, and we made drafting errors. There was one, so in the Open Act, which Darrell introduced with Senator Ron Wyden, in the Senate, there was a part where we said all domain name owners and registrants are the same people and will be legally liable. Well, everybody in this room knows that you can buy a domain and the register can be different. Somebody caught that. That was a really dumb mistake. And that was only because we had it up with a ton of eyes on it for a long time.
That's great. Hey, so Jonathan Feldman asks, cities also have pressure from the IT cartel. Don't use open source, for example. Can you recommend strategies to resist?
Well, I mean,
I think we had one from Nancy Reagan a long time ago.
just say no. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that the counter prevailing weight is putting up these open data sets and creating an opportunity for citizen developers to get engaged and moving forward with the principles, Tim, you've been outstandingly leading on for decades and looking at government as a platform and not necessarily an application provider. And all of a sudden now we have a different form of competition. So we're not building things, buying things, but we're moving in a much more strategic way away from large top-down hierarchical IT departments in the old model to creating a different kind of platform engagement and getting on-demand resources to solve the same problems.
Alex Howard asked a question which I'm not going to quote exactly because it hits on a key idea that I want to think about, so I'm going to put it in my own words. And that is, can open data and open government actually help us see a way to shrink government? Because that's one of the big, partisan issues is government's too big. On the other hand, the Democrats say, but look at all the problems that are still here to be solved. And to me, the answer is, if we can really make it more effective, we can have smaller government and solve more problems.
Amen.
And that's what we should be focused on. Do you guys see that, and can you comment on the possibilities there?
Well, I certainly hope so. Look, I don't want to debate the size of the machine. I want to talk about a different model of engagement. And I think that's why this is legitimately, not just rhetorically, a bipartisan moment and opportunity to start bringing some people together around a different paradigm of thinking. It's not just a technological solution we're talking about, it's a cultural mind shift. The opportunity to engage experts that exist outside the walls of government, that all this latent expertise, every single person here is an expert in something, none of us an expert in everything. How do we engage folks in a different kind of co-creation and co-production? There should not be a government pill for every problem. And I say that as a progressive Democrat. I learned the hard way that more is not better. Better is better. And just passing a program doesn't solve a problem. So creating a different kind of engagement, I think, solves two big problems.
Well, it's particularly true when, each new fix is piled on top of the old fix. We never sort of take out the one that didn't work and replace it with something else. We've talked a lot about agile and lean startup. And, the government is kind of like a lean startup where you have new hypotheses and pivots all the time, but you leave the old one in place too. And so you never actually, you never actually incorporate the learning. You just simply, put on more layers.
Just iterating the old model. You got to change the architecture, the plumbing.
Yeah, I think everybody in this room is interested in a government, state, local, or federal, that serves better and spends less, does more with less. And on top of that, everybody in this room is sick of partisan fighting because it just isn't productive. So how do you break through both of those things, or achieve the first and break through the second? It's what we're talking about up here. When you scrape away all the bullshit that government works on and hold it up in the cold, naked light of day and say, this is what we're fighting about, these words, this is it, you're going to have programs and bills just not introduced because it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And I think what ties all of this together is we're putting eyes on all of this crap.
Yeah, I feel really bad because there's a lot of great questions here, and I'm looking at the clock and we're running out of time. You guys have any final comments, or shall I ask one last question?
One more question for me.
All right. Jess Montejano says, how do you truly incorporate citizen input when, by definition, the legislation needs to contain legal language that the public lacks?
Well, I mean,
I have an answer for that, but
yeah. Well, what's your answer?
Well, first thing is you could make that same argument about open source code. You've got to be a programmer to some extent. You do need to understand the issues. You do need to understand the legal language. But as you explained with the Data Act, you can simplify this stuff. And the fact that this code, one of the things I remember in the early arguments about open source software, companies were saying we can't expose our software because it's so bad. you know? And so one of the things that open source did is it led companies to make better, cleaner, more readable software so they wouldn't be embarrassed. And I think, quite honestly, you know, we can make legislation that citizens can understand. I mean, the fact is, this country is based on founding documents that anyone can read and understand.
Absolutely.
And we need to have our laws be meaningful and readable.
The principles that undergird everything here are of the people and by the people. The job of government is to take those principles and transform that into operative legislation and marching orders. That has nothing to do with understandable. I know Jess and we're working on a small little technical fix that came out of sanfranciscocode.org. Somebody used the Google machine to find a bad bike law and used a discus comment engine to say, this is silly and this doesn't seem to match up with what San Francisco is doing to promote use of bikes. We emailed that to Jess, and his boss, Supervisor Mark Farrell, is working on a fix. I mean, that doesn't need a lawyer in there. That's just common sense.
Yeah, and I think you do get this idea of distributed micro-expertise. By the way, a great book on that is Michael Nielsen's Reinventing Discovery. It's about open science, but it applies here too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, somebody can figure that out and make it clear.
And just in closing, as time's up, I hope we look past just legislation. Legislating is one very small part of governing. The real work of governing is not just between those 364 days legislating and between elections. It's the day-to-day activity of literally millions and millions of people and the application of these rules and laws and how we can create a different form of engagement and accountability. Look, the answer to your first question, what's open government from my perspective? It's all about transparency. As we say, it's about undressing for success. It's all about collaboration, not just within the walls of your organization, but outside those walls. And it's about empowerment. It's about giving people the tools to be more active and participatory, not being treated, as we've talked about, as subjects, but being part of that co-creation and co-production of the life of their city and our state. So I hope, again, the framework is about unleashing the remarkable talents of people that are trapped in a very, very difficult, constraining environment called bureaucracy, and unleashing their capacity to lead with all of us as co-creators in that process.
What he said.
Amen. And that sounds like a great set of marching orders for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.